The monitor screamed before anyone else did.
Vefip.
"He's coding?" a nurse called out, and Dr. Simone Bishop was already moving, white coat snapping behind her as she shoved through the double doors of CO Rim International's cardiac ICU. 3 weeks into her fellowship in Seoul, and she'd learned exactly how far heels could carry a person at a dead run. Today made it 4 times. "Talk to me," she said, sliding into position at the bedside, 2 fingers already finding the carotid pulse before her eyes had even reached the monitor. He was 71, 2 days out from a triple bypass, and his pressure was crashing as the monitor dissolved into chaos above his head. "Started 30 seconds ago," the attending Korean resident said, already charging the paddles. "We called you the second. Charge to 200, Simone said, cutting him off, calm as still water. "Everyone clear." The body on the table jolted. The line on the monitor stuttered, dropped, then found its rhythm again, ragged but alive. Simone exhaled through her nose, the only sign she gave that her heart had been doing anything other than its job for the last 90 seconds. "Sinus rhythm," she said. "Get me a repeat troponin and call cardiothoracic surgery to confirm the graft didn't slip. I want eyes on him every 5 minutes until I say otherwise." The resident, Dr. Kwan, looked at her the way most of them did now, somewhere between awe and mild offense that a 29-year-old foreigner kept being right. "You knew before the monitor did." "I've been wrong before," Simone said, already pulling off her gloves. "Today's just not the day." She didn't have time to enjoy the small, private satisfaction of a save. Her pager was already buzzing again, a consult request from the executive wing, the kind of patient whose chart came with a note that said "handle personally, no exceptions," attached to a family that apparently owned a sizable percentage of the building she was standing in. She grabbed her tablet and the coffee Dr. Kwan had left for her at the nurse's station, already gone cold, and headed for the elevator at a half jog. She did not notice, as she rounded the corner toward the executive lounge, that the entire hallway had already gone quiet the particular way hallways went quiet whenever Cho Sung-hyun was in the building. 2 floors up, in a private lounge with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that cost more than most people's cars, Sung-hyun was failing to look like a man whose patience had a limit, because he didn't believe in showing one. "She's the director of Day One Trading's only daughter," his uncle, Cho Yong-tae, was saying, in the particular tone he used when he thought he was being subtle. "Educated in Switzerland. Speaks 4 languages. Her father has expressed considerable interest in an alliance," Sung-hyun said. "I know what he's expressed interest in, uncle. I read the same reports you do. It would secure the northern shipping contracts for the next decade. The contracts are already secured. I secured them 8 months ago, without offering anyone's daughter as collateral." He didn't raise his voice. He never did. Silence worked better than volume. A sentence left hanging in a room had a way of suffocating whoever had been foolish enough to invite it. "Tell Director Yuri's father I'm flattered. And tell him I said no the same way I told the Beck family no, and the Songs and the 3 before them. Your grandfather wants this resolved before. My grandfather wants to see me at peace before he dies," Sung-hyun said, something in his voice finally sharpening. "Just slightly, just enough. He has said that to me himself. He has never once said he wants me married to a stranger who looks at me and sees a merger. Don't use him to win an argument you've already lost." Yong-tae's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. Sung-hyun had long since stopped waiting for people to argue with him. They rarely did, not more than once. He glanced through the glass wall toward the private suite where his grandfather was finishing a follow-up scan. Routine, the cardiologist kept saying. Just routine, the same word they'd used for 2 years about a heart Sung-hyun privately suspected was holding on out of sheer stubbornness more than biology. It was the only reason he tolerated this hospital's endless parade of specialists and the family's endless parade of marriage candidates in the same afternoon. His grandfather was the one person alive who had never once asked him for anything he wasn't already willing to give. Everyone else wanted the name, the company, the quiet, terrifying reputation that came attached to the Cho group like a shadow nobody mentioned directly. No one had ever wanted him. He was thinking exactly that, with the particular bitterness of a man who had decided a long time ago that it didn't matter, when he stepped out of the lounge, turned toward the elevators, and a hot, sudden weight collided directly into his chest. Coffee. An entire cup of it, cold and bitter, soaking through $800 of bespoke wool in under a second. Oh my, I am so sorry. The woman in front of him was already crouching, grabbing napkins out of nowhere, pressing them uselessly against his ruined jacket before she seemed to register that he wasn't moving, or reacting, or doing anything at all except staring down at her like she'd materialized out of the building's air conditioning. She had dark eyes, a furious ponytail coming loose at the crown, and a hospital badge that read Doctorus Bishop, Cardiothoracic, Fellow. It's fine, he heard himself say, which was strange, because it absolutely was not fine, and nothing was ever fine, and yet the words came out before he'd authorized them. It is not fine, that's a... She glanced at the jacket and winced. That's definitely not a fine jacket. I'll pay for the dry cleaning. Her pager buzzed against her hip, sharp and insistent, and her whole posture changed, snapping toward it like a compass finding north. She read it in half a second and was already standing, already moving past him. I have a patient waiting on me, she said, more to herself than to him. And I'm already late, and I'm sorry about your jacket, but he doesn't care that I ruined a stranger's suit. So, she looked up at him fully, for the first time, and something flickered across her face, not recognition. Not the particular widening of the eyes that came when people realized exactly whose chest they'd thrown coffee on. Just mild, fleeting concern, the kind anyone might offer a stranger. You're not burned, are you? It wasn't that hot. No, Sung-hyun said. Good. Okay. Sorry again. And she was gone, disappearing around the corner at the same dead run she'd arrived with, leaving him standing in a hallway that had gone entirely silent, cold coffee soaking through his shirt, with absolutely no memory of the last time someone had looked at him and seen nothing but a man whose jacket she'd ruined. Sang-chul, who had been 3 steps behind him the entire time as he always was, cleared his throat carefully. Sir, your jacket. I heard her the first time. Should I have her reprimanded? Hospital staff aren't meant to. She didn't know who I was. Sung-hyun said it slowly, testing whether the sentence held any weight when spoken out loud. In 33 years, in a city where his face had been in business journals since he was 26, where strangers crossed streets to avoid him without knowing exactly why, where women had been arranged in front of him by their own fathers since he turned 28, no one, not once, had looked at him with that particular, blinding absence of fear or hunger or calculation. She'd looked at him like he was an inconvenience standing between her and a patient. Nothing more, nothing less. It should have insulted him. Standing there with coffee cooling against his ribs, he found it had done something closer to the opposite. Sir, find out everything about Drivus, Bishop, Sung-hyun said, already walking toward the elevator. His voice perfectly level again, perfectly controlled, betraying nothing of the way his pulse had not yet returned to its normal, careful rhythm. Where she's from, why she's here, how long her fellowship runs. Sang-chul, who had worked for the Cho family for 11 years and had never once been asked to look into a woman, allowed himself exactly 1 second of visible surprise before he caught it. Yes, sir. Tonight. Yes, sir. Sung-hyun stepped into the elevator alone. The doors slid shut, sealing him into the quiet, mirrored box that had carried him up and down this building 10,000 times without anything inside it ever once feeling different. Tonight it felt different. He caught his own reflection in the brushed steel and almost didn't recognize the expression on his face. Something unguarded. Something he hadn't worn in public since he was young enough not to know better. He smoothed it away before the doors opened on the executive floor. Old habits. But it had been there. He knew it had been there, the way a person knows a wound is bleeding even after they've covered it. He had spent 15 years building a life where nothing got close enough to touch him. A spilled coffee and 30 seconds in a hallway had done more damage than any boardroom rival ever had. If you're already feeling it, that particular ache of watching someone who spent his whole life freezing himself solid start to crack, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because what happens when Cho Sung-hyun decides he wants something for the first time in his life is exactly the kind of story you don't want to come back later trying to find. Down on the 4th floor, Simone had no idea any of that had happened. She was elbow deep in a chart, already 3 patients past the man in the expensive, ruined jacket, already forgetting his face the way she forgot most things that weren't directly in front of her. Except she didn't forget it. Not really. Hours later, scrubbing in for her last consult of the day, she caught herself thinking, unbidden, about a pair of dark eyes that hadn't blinked once, and a stillness in a man's whole body that had nothing to do with shock and everything to do with something she didn't have a name for yet. She shook it off. She had a country to learn, a fellowship to survive, and exactly zero interest in figuring out why a stranger's stare was still sitting somewhere behind her ribs at 6 o'clock in the evening. She had no idea that across the city, behind the glass walls of the tower that bore his family's name, a man who had never once asked anyone to look into a woman's life already had people pulling her file, and that the quiet, careful order he'd built around himself for 15 years had already, irreversibly, begun to come apart. 3 days passed before Simone saw him again, and when she did, it was nothing like she expected. She'd been called up to the executive floor for the second time that week. A different patient this time. An elderly board member with arrhythmia the in-house doctors were too nervous to manage without a specialist's signature on the chart. She stepped out of the elevator already reading her tablet and nearly walked straight into him a second time. Except this time he didn't look surprised to see her at all. "Dr. Bishop," he said. He knew her name. Of course he knew her name. She looked up, recognized the suit before she recognized the face. An entirely different jacket this time. No coffee stains, and felt something in her chest do a small, traitorous flip that she immediately decided to ignore. "You're the jacket guy. Cho Sung-hyun," he said, like that was supposed to mean something to her. When her expression didn't change, something almost like amusement crossed his face, gone as quickly as it came. "My family's foundation built this hospital. I sit on the board that controls its funding." "Congratulations," she said, deadpan, already moving past him toward her patient's room. "I have a patient waiting on me, Mr. Cho. Try not to ruin any more suits." He didn't follow her. He didn't need to. He simply stood there in the hallway, watching her disappear through a doorway without a single backward glance, and felt, for the second time in 3 days, the particular dangerous pleasure of being looked at like he was nobody at all. 3 weeks after the coffee incident, Simone got a phone call that made her stop walking in the middle of a hallway. "Say that again," she said. $10 million, Dr. Park Young-min repeated. And even over the phone she could hear him still not quite believing it himself. He was the chief of cardiothoracic surgery, a man who had spent the last 18 months telling her, gently but firmly, that her minimally invasive valve research was promising but unfunded, and that promising but unfunded was simply where good ideas went to wait their turn. Routed through the Cho Family Medical Foundation. Anonymous donor, but the foundation's lawyers were very specific about the terms. What terms? The grant funds a new structural heart program, full surgical suite, 2 research fellows, equipment we couldn't have gotten approved for another 5 years. He paused. "And it's yours, not the department's. Yours specifically. Dr. Simone Bishop must personally direct the program, or the funding is withdrawn." "That's not me being generous, Simone. That's the actual language in the documents." Simone stood very still in the hallway, the way she only ever stood still when something didn't add up on a chart. "That's not how endowments work. Nobody hands a fellow $10 million and a building wing with no strings except her name on the paperwork. Apparently somebody just did." She thanked him, hung up, and stood there a moment longer with her phone in her hand, running through the very short list of people in Seoul who had both that kind of money and a reason to spend it on her. The list had exactly one name on it, and she did not like that it did. She found out she was right 2 days later. In a board meeting she hadn't known she'd be attending until Dr. Park texted her 40 minutes beforehand to put on something professional and bring her slide deck. The conference room on the executive floor had a view of the entire city and a table long enough to seat 20, only 12 of whom showed up: hospital administrators, 2 foundation trustees, and, seated at the far end like he'd always been there, like the room had been built around the space he was currently occupying, Cho Sung-hyun. He didn't look at her when she walked in. That, more than anything, was what convinced her she'd been right about the money. "Dr. Bishop," the board chair said, "walk us through the program timeline." She did. She'd given this pitch a dozen times to a dozen committees who'd nodded politely and funded someone else's project instead, and she knew it cold: the device, the trial design, the patients it would save in a country where heart failure killed more people every year than the news ever reported. She was 4 minutes into it, hitting her stride, when Dr. Jang from cardiology cut her off. "With respect," he said, in the tone people used right before they said something with no respect in it at all. This is an enormous commitment of resources for a fellow who's been in this hospital for less than 2 months. Perhaps the program should be directed by someone with a longer institutional track record, and Dr. Bishop could serve in a supporting. Dr. Bishop wasn't finished, Sung-hyun said. He hadn't raised his voice. He never did. But the room went quiet the way it always did for him, and Dr. Jang's mouth closed mid-sentence like a door easing shut. I'd like to hear the rest of Dr. Bishop's presentation, Sung-hyun continued, looking at Simone now for the first time since she'd walked in. Before anyone in this room decides what they think of it. Simone looked back at him for a long second. Then she looked down at her slides, found her place and kept going, because she had not built a career on letting one interruption knock her off a sentence. And she certainly wasn't going to let the man who'd apparently bought her an entire department do it either. She finished the pitch. Nobody else interrupted. The board approved the program in 9 minutes, which Dr. Park later told her was the fastest approval he'd seen in 14 years at the hospital. She caught Sung-hyun in the hallway afterward, before he could disappear into an elevator the way he seemed to disappear into everything. We need to talk, she said. About the program? About the donor. Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. The donor's identity is confidential. Foundation policy.
Cho Seang-hyun.
She said his full name slowly, watching him. You sit on the foundation board. You funded a project that didn't exist until 3 weeks ago, with terms written specifically so that nobody but me could run it, 3 weeks after I spilled coffee on you in this exact hallway. I'm a surgeon, not an idiot. I never said you were an idiot. You also didn't say no. He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet she watched him decide something. She could see it happening, the way you could sometimes see a patient decide mid-conversation to finally tell you the symptom they'd been too embarrassed to mention. Your research was good, he said finally. Underfunded, but good. I have money. The hospital had a gap. I closed it. That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving you in a hallway. Then give me a better one somewhere that isn't a hallway. It came out before she'd fully decided to say it, and she watched it land on him, watched something behind his eyes go very still and very alert at the same time. Like a man hearing a sound he hadn't been sure he was allowed to hope for. Dinner, he said. Tonight. I'll have a car sent. I don't need a car. I have a perfectly functional pair of legs and a Naver Maps app. The car, he said, is for me. I'd like to ride in it with you. Despite herself, despite 3 weeks of telling herself this man was simply a strange, wealthy footnote to her fellowship, Simone felt the corner of her mouth pull upward before she could stop it. Fine. But I'm asking you everything tonight. Why the money? Why me? Why you went completely silent the whole time I was apologizing? Like I'd grown a second head when all I did was apologize for ruining your suit. I look forward to it, he said, and for the first time since she'd met him, she watched Cho Sung-hyun smile. Not the polite, practiced curve of a man performing pleasantness for a board meeting, but something smaller and far more dangerous, the kind of smile that looked like it had been locked away somewhere and had just found the door unguarded. That night, in the break room 3 floors below the one where Simone was getting ready to leave early for the first time since she'd arrived in Seoul. Her friend Dr. Hannah Lee was waiting with 2 coffees and an expression that meant gossip had reached her before facts had. You're having dinner with Cho Sung-hyun, Hannah said. It wasn't a question. How does anyone in this building already know that? Because his driver called ahead to ask the kitchen at Jungsik to clear their private room. And the kitchen staff at Jungsik are married to half the nursing staff here. Hannah slid one of the coffees across the table. Simone, do you understand what you're doing? Having dinner. You're having dinner with a man who doesn't go to board meetings. Ever. He has people who attend board meetings so he doesn't have to look at anyone he doesn't want to look at. He has never personally funded a department. He has never, in the 4 years I've worked here, said more than 6 words to a doctor below attending level. Hannah leaned forward. And he just bought you a wing. It's a research program. It's not a wing. It will be a wing by Christmas, and you know it. Hannah studied her for a second, the teasing dropping out of her voice. I'm not trying to scare you off. I just want you to go in with your eyes open. Money like that doesn't come without strings. Even when the man holding it swears there aren't any. Simone thought about the way he'd looked at her in the boardroom. like the rest of the table had simply stopped existing the moment she'd opened her mouth. She thought about the smile in the hallway, small and unguarded and entirely unlike the rest of him. "I know there are strings," she said quietly. "I just haven't figured out yet whether I mind being attached to them. If you're already rooting for these two, hit subscribe. It only gets better from here." She didn't tell Hannah the rest of it, that she'd spent the last 3 weeks quietly looking him up too, late at night, scrolling through old business articles and grainy photographs of a man who never smiled in any of them, trying to reconcile the headlines with the version of him who'd stood frozen in a hallway over a ruined jacket. The articles called him calculating, untouchable, a man who ran half the legitimate business in Seoul and, according to 2 separate investigative pieces neither of which had ever been substantiated, considerably more of the business that wasn't legitimate at all. None of it matched the man who'd defended her in a boardroom like it cost him nothing and meant everything. She told herself she was simply curious. She told herself a lot of things, that week, that she didn't quite manage to believe. Across the city, in the tower that bore his family's name, Sung-hyun stood at his window with a tie already loosened and a reservation confirmed for 8 o'clock, and felt, for the first time he could remember, something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite hope but lived somewhere dangerously close to both. The dinner ran 3 hours, though afterward neither of them could account for where the second hour had gone. Sung-hyun ordered in Korean without looking at the menu, and Simone caught herself, halfway through her second course, doing something she hadn't done since residency, forgetting to check her phone for 45 straight minutes. He didn't ask her about the hospital. He asked her about Houston, about her mother who'd worked the overnight shift at a hospital 20 minutes from their house her entire childhood, about the exact moment Simone had decided hearts were the only organ worth specializing in. "Most people pick neuro or oncology if they want to feel important," he said. "Why hearts?" "Because everything else can wait for morning," she said. "A heart can't." I liked that there wasn't room to be uncertain. He was quiet for a moment, turning that over like it meant more to him than the sentence should have. "I understand that better than you'd think." She didn't ask what he meant. She just noted it quietly the way she noted a symptom that didn't fit a diagnosis yet, certain she'd need it eventually. The weeks that followed fell into something Simone hadn't expected and wasn't sure she'd agreed to, a rhythm. He didn't call constantly. He didn't show up uninvited. He simply existed, periodically, at the edges of her schedule, a car waiting outside the hospital on nights she worked past midnight, a text that said nothing but home safe, and expected nothing but a single word back. She told herself this was restraint. To Hannah, she admitted it felt like being quietly watched over by someone who'd never once asked her permission. She wasn't sure most days which version of the story she believed. The apartment situation, when it came fast. Structural renovations, her landlord told her over the phone, not quite meeting the lie with enough conviction to make it sound true. "You will need to vacate by the end of the month." "I am sorry, Dr. Bishop. The building owner has decided." "Which owner?" "You're the owner." "There is a holding company," the landlord said, and hung up before Simone could ask which one. She found the new place through the hospital's relocation office, of all things. A one-line email from HR mentioning a furnished unit near the hospital had opened up at a reduced rate through a corporate housing partnership, available immediately if she wanted it. She didn't have the energy to be suspicious. She had 4 days to find somewhere to sleep and a 16-hour shift in 6 hours. She took it. The apartment was, by any reasonable measure, far nicer than she could afford on her own. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a kitchen better than the one in her parents' house, a view of the river she stood in front of for a full minute the night she moved in before she let herself believe it was actually hers, even temporarily. She found out exactly how temporary the illusion of coincidence was 3 nights later, in the lobby at 11 p.m., still in scrubs, holding a bag of late-night kimbap. She pressed the call button for the elevator. The doors opened, and Sung-hyun was already inside. Coming up from the garage, tie loosened, looking like a man arriving home rather than visiting it. Simone stared at him for a full 3 seconds before her brain caught up to what her stomach already knew. "You live here.
Ido.
You own this building.
Ido. Cho Seang-hyun.
Her voice came out flatter and more dangerous than she'd intended. "Did you have my landlord lie to me about structural renovations so that I would end up in your building?" He didn't flinch, Didn't perform the small theater of guilt most people reached for when they'd been caught. Yes, that's... She laughed. A short, disbelieving sound with no humor in it at all. That's stalking. Do you understand that's stalking? It isn't. His voice stayed level, the way it always did. But something underneath it had gone careful, deliberate, like a man choosing each word the way he'd choose a chess move. Stalking is something men do in secret, Dr. Bishop. I'm not hiding what I did. I found out your old building had been failing fire inspections for a year before your landlord did anything about it. I bought a property with better security, better locks, a doorman who actually stays awake, and I made sure it was available to you specifically. I'm not sorry for the second part. I'd apologize for the first, except I'm not sorry for that either. You don't get to make decisions about where I live. I'm not making decisions about where you live. You can leave tonight if you want to. I'll have someone find you another apartment by morning, somewhere with nothing to do with me at all, and you'll never see me in an elevator again. He paused. I'd prefer you stayed, but my door's 2 floors up, Simone, and it's never locked. Not to you. It was the first time he'd used her first name, and she noticed it the way she noticed an irregular rhythm on a monitor, small, but impossible to unhear once she had, even as she refused to think too hard about it right then. Her late-night kimbap going cold in the bag between them while the elevator climbed past the floor she'd meant to get off on. She rode it back down alone a minute later, let herself into her own apartment, and didn't move out that week, the way some clearer-headed version of herself probably should have. She told Hannah the next morning, mostly because she needed someone to confirm she wasn't losing her mind. He had your landlord lie to you, Hannah repeated, eyes wide. So you'd move into his building. That's the part one can't get past. That's the part you're upset about? Hannah set down her coffee. Simone, he found out your building had bad fire code violations and quietly fixed your housing situation without asking for anything in return except proximity. Do you understand how many men in this city would have just sent flowers and called it a gesture? It's still controlling. It's controlling in the specific way that happens to also be thoughtful, which is the most dangerous kind. Hannah studied her for a second. Are you going to move out? Simone thought about the view of the river. She thought, longer than she wanted to admit, about the way he'd said her first name like it had weight he intended to carry. No, she said finally. I'm not. Then stop telling me you're upset about it and start telling me what you're actually feeling. Simone didn't have an answer for that one yet. She didn't see him every day after that. She didn't need to. He left things instead, small, specific, infuriatingly thoughtful things. A container of soup outside her door on the night she worked a 19-hour shift, with a note in sharp, slanted handwriting that read, "You operated for 11 hours today. Eat this before you forget you're allowed to." A second note, 2 weeks later, taped to a bag of the specific brand of ginger candy she'd mentioned once, in passing, during the dinner she'd assumed he hadn't fully listened to. For the nausea you didn't think I noticed. She kept every note. She told herself it was for research purposes, evidence, in case she ever needed to prove to Hannah that the man was, in fact, completely unhinged. She did not examine too closely why she'd started reading them twice before throwing away the wrapping. The storm hit on a Tuesday, the kind of late summer downpour that grounded every taxi in the city within 20 minutes and turned the hospital's pickup circle into a small lake. Simone stood under the awning at midnight while her rideshare app spun uselessly on a driver who had already canceled twice, her phone battery dropping into the single digits. She accepted, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been awake for 18 hours, that she was going to be standing there for a while. A black car pulled up directly in front of her at 12 minutes past midnight. A driver at the wheel and Sung-hyun already sitting in the back. The door opened before the car had fully stopped. "Get in," he said. "How did you know I was standing out here?" "I told my security team to let me know if anything happened involving you. A doctor stranded outside in a storm at midnight counts as something happening." He said it like it wasn't an unusual thing to admit. "Get in, Simone. You're soaked." She got in. She was too tired to argue, and some smaller, quieter part of her simply didn't want to. He didn't talk for the first 10 minutes. He'd brought a blanket, which he didn't make a show of offering, just left folded on the seat between them until she finally pulled it over her own knees without being asked. The rain came down hard enough that the windshield wipers gave up keeping pace with it. Lightning split the sky outside, close enough that the thunder came less than a second behind it, loud enough that Simone flinched before she could stop herself. His hand found hers in the dark, not asking permission, not making a comment, just there, steady, until the thunder rolled away and she realized she hadn't pulled back. "You're afraid of storms," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm not afraid of storms. I'm afraid of the noise. There's a difference. Tell me the difference." She looked at him for a long moment, at the line of his jaw lit gold and then dark again by the streetlights sliding past, and found, for reasons she couldn't entirely account for, that she wanted to actually answer the question instead of deflecting it the way she deflected everything that got too close. "My mother worked nights," she said. "ICU, 20 minutes from our house. When it stormed, the power would go out, and I used to lie awake convinced something was wrong at the hospital, that she wasn't coming home. I was 7 the first time it happened. I've never really stopped being 7 about it, if I'm honest." He didn't say anything for a moment, his thumb moving once, slowly, across her knuckles. "I used to sit outside my grandfather's office during storms," he said finally, "because he was the only person in that house who never went quiet when the power flickered. I told myself I liked the company. Mostly, I think I just didn't want to find out what an empty house sounded like during a blackout." "Where were your parents?" "My father ran the company before me. He was busy building the version of it I inherited. My mother left when I was 9 and didn't take me with her." He said it the way he said everything, flat and controlled, but his hand tightened slightly around hers. "My grandfather is the only person who ever stayed in a room with me during a storm because he wanted to, not because someone assigned him to." Simone turned her hand in his, slowly, until their fingers were properly laced instead of simply touching, an answer she didn't trust herself to say out loud yet. They didn't talk for the rest of the drive. They didn't need to. The car pulled into the garage beneath the building they both now called home, and neither of them moved to let go of the other's hand until long after the engine had gone quiet. If this is the part where you start hoping he never lets go either, you know what to do, hit subscribe. That night, she went up to her own floor alone. Going up alone was the only part of that night that had felt like her own decision, instead of something simply happening to her. She wouldn't realize that until later. She saw him briefly the next morning in the hospital lobby. He fell into step beside her for the length of it, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and said, low enough that only she could hear it, "I meant what I said. My door's never locked to you." "I know," Simone said. "I'm not asking you to say anything back. I know that too." She glanced at him sideways, allowing herself, for just a moment, the small, dangerous luxury of a smile. "I just haven't decided yet if I'm ready to." He had spent 15 years making decisions instantly without revision. This was, by far, the most patient he had ever been about anything. The email arrived on a Wednesday, in the middle of a clinic afternoon, and Simone read it twice before she let herself believe what it said. "Dr. Bishop, the search committee at Magnolia Heart Institute is pleased to offer you the founding director position for our new structural heart program, effective as early as January. We would be honored to have you home." Home. She sat with that word longer than she sat with anything else in the email. Houston, 20 minutes from her mother's house. A program built from nothing, with her name on the door instead of someone else's, funded by a hospital board that had never once met Cho Sung-hyun and never would need to. She didn't tell anyone for 3 days. She told Hannah first over coffee in the break room, because some decisions needed a witness before they became real. "They want you to run your own program. In Houston. Near your mom." Hannah said it slowly, watching Simone's face. "Why do you look like someone just told you bad news?" "It's not bad news. You're allowed to want it and still be sad about leaving, Simone. Those aren't opposite things. It's not just leaving the hospital." Simone turned her coffee cup a quarter turn, the way she did when she was deciding how honest to be. "Everything I have here, the research program, the funding, even this apartment, all of it exists because Sung-hyun decided it should. If I take the Houston job, it's mine. Nobody bought it for me. Nobody's name is attached to it except mine. You think the work you did to get that program approved, the surgeries you've done, the program you've actually built with your own hands, isn't yours just because he wrote a check first?" Simone didn't have an answer for that. She hadn't expected that question. If she was being honest with herself, She hadn't expected any of it. She told him 3 nights later, on the rooftop terrace of the hospital, after a board dinner had cleared the building out and left the city to itself. I got an offer, she said, no preamble, because she'd learned by now that he preferred information delivered the way she delivered it during an emergency. Fast, clear, no cushioning. Houston, she said. A brand new structural heart program. Built from nothing, with me as its director if I accept. Something in his face went very still. Not cold, not controlled. Just a man who had not been prepared for those words, sitting with them in real time. When would you leave? January if I accept. Have you accepted? I haven't decided. He was quiet long enough that the silence started to feel like its own answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the careful, level control she'd come to recognize as armor. I'm not going to ask you to stay because of me. I don't have the right to ask that, and I think you'd resent me for it if I tried. She looked at him. But you want to. He held her gaze. More than I've wanted anything in a long time. His uncle showed up at his office 2 days later. A board member had been at the hospital for a late meeting and seen them on the rooftop together. By morning it had made its way back to the family, the way things in his world always did. Quietly, efficiently, and with an agenda already attached. You're risking the northern contracts over an American surgeon, Youngtae said, not bothering to sit down in Sung-hyun's office, which was its own kind of statement. The Day One family has not forgotten your refusal. If word reaches them that you're involved with a hospital employee, an outsider, they will use it as exactly the excuse they've been waiting for. Then let them. Sung-hyun. I have spent 15 years protecting this family's interests at the cost of every interest of my own, Sung-hyun said, and his voice, when it finally rose only slightly, which from him was the equivalent of shouting. I gave up the right to choose who I loved before I was old enough to understand what I was giving up. I am not doing it twice. Youngtae studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite surrender, but lived somewhere between both. Your grandfather will want to meet her, he said finally, before you do something irreversible. He already knows about her. Of course he does. Youngtae allowed himself something almost like a smile on his way out the door. He's the one who told me to come talk you out of it. He didn't actually want me to succeed. He wanted to see if you'd let me try. 2 nights later, Sung-hyun asked her to meet him on the hospital rooftop at 11. After her shift ended, and gave no other explanation. She found magnolias, dozens of them, somehow blooming weeks out of season, arranged in clusters along a path of small lanterns that led to a single table set for 2. A speaker somewhere nearby played something low and warm, gospel-tinged, the kind of music that belonged in a kitchen on a Sunday morning rather than on a rooftop in Seoul. How? Simone said, and couldn't manage anything more articulate than that. Your mother's hospital was 2 blocks from a church your grandmother attended every Sunday for 40 years. Hannah mentioned, once, that you hum something like this when you think no one's listening in the supply closet. He said it without performance, the way he said everything, but something in his voice had gone unsteady in a way she'd never heard from him before. I couldn't bring you Houston. I couldn't bring you your mother or that church or whatever it is you miss most about home. I could only get this close. I wanted you to know I noticed. All of it. Not just the parts of you that are useful to a hospital board. Simone walked the rest of the path in silence, because she didn't trust her voice yet, and stopped in front of him at the table, close enough to see that his hands, when he reached for hers, weren't entirely steady either. I have never wanted to know anyone the way I want to know you, he said. I don't know what to do with that. I've never had to. What are you asking me, Sung-hyun? I'm not asking you to choose between Houston and me. I would never survive being the reason you gave up everything you worked your whole life toward. He took a breath, the first unguarded breath she'd ever watched him take. I'm telling you that wherever you decide to build that program, I am already irreversibly in love with you. I have been since a woman who didn't know my name handed me a fistful of napkins and ran toward someone who needed her more than I did. I didn't think that was possible for me. I built an entire life on the assumption that it wasn't. You walked through it in 30 seconds and proved me wrong. Simone looked at him for a long moment at the magnolias, at the man who had rebuilt a piece of her childhood on a rooftop in a country 6,000 miles from home because he had been paying attention the entire time she'd assumed he was simply being strange. She kissed him first. It wasn't gentle, not at first, 3 months of restraint on both sides finally giving way at once. And when they finally broke apart, breathless, his hand still resting against her coat, he looked at her like a man who had just watched the most certain decision of his life arrive somewhere he could finally touch it. "I haven't decided about Houston," she said, somewhere against his mouth. "I know. I'm not deciding tonight. I'm not asking you to." He pressed his forehead to hers, and for the first time in the entire conversation, Cho Sung-hyun smiled, unguarded, the way she imagined he must have smiled before the world had taught him not to. "Tonight, I'd just like to be the man you decided to kiss. We can figure out the rest of it together. If you're as far gone for these two as they are for each other right now, hit subscribe." They stayed on that rooftop long after the lanterns had burned low, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, with her head on his shoulder and his hand tracing slow, absent circles against her arm, Simone realized she had stopped weighing Houston against Seoul and started, instead, simply wondering how she'd ever build a life that didn't have him in it somewhere. His grandfather's name was Cho Byung-soo, and he was, as far as Simone could tell within the first 4 minutes of meeting him, the only person alive who could make Sung-hyun look nervous. He received them in a private sitting room on the top floor of the Cho family's main residence, a house large enough that it took a full staff just to keep it running. He was 78, small in the way that men who had once been formidable sometimes became with age, and he had Sung-hyun's eyes, dark, unhurried, the kind that made you feel seen in a way you hadn't necessarily consented to. "Sit," he said in Korean, and then looked at Simone and repeated it in careful, accented English. "Please." Sung-hyun had warned her on the drive over that his grandfather had opinions, that he would ask direct questions and expect direct answers, and that any attempt to be polished or diplomatic would be seen through immediately and held against her. She'd asked if there was anything she should avoid saying. He'd thought about it for a moment and said, "Honestly, no, just be exactly what you are," and she'd understood from the way he said it that it was both advice and a confession. Byung-soo poured tea himself, waving off the staff member who stepped forward to do it, and set a cup in front of Simone with the deliberate care of a man who had decided this gesture was his to give personally. "My grandson," he said, "has not brought anyone to this house in 15 years. "I know," Simone said. "Does that frighten you?"
No.
"It tells me he doesn't do things halfway." Something moved across the old man's face. Not quite a smile and not quite surprise. Something warmer and more private than either. He glanced at Sung-hyun, who was sitting very still in the way he sat still when he was working hard not to show something. "She's right," Byung-soo said, mostly to himself. Then, back to Simone. "You're thinking about leaving the job in America." "I'm still deciding." "What is making it difficult to decide?" Simone looked at him for a moment. He had asked the question the way doctors asked questions, with the particular patience of someone who already had a working theory and simply wanted to hear you arrive at it yourself. "I've worked my whole life for something that belongs entirely to me," she said finally. "The Houston offer is that. Everything I have here is real and I'm proud of it, but it started with his money. That matters to me." "It should," Byung-soo said simply. "It means you have the kind of pride that cannot be bought. In my experience, that is the only kind worth having." He lifted his own cup, took a slow sip, and regarded her over the rim of it with those unhurried eyes. "He is difficult," he said. "I say this as the person who raised him. He is private to the point of cruelty. He does not explain himself when he should, and he will reorganize your entire life around keeping you safe without once asking if you wanted him to."
Eva noticed.
"And you're still here." "I'm still deciding," she said again, but she was almost smiling when she said it, and the old man caught it the way he caught everything. He turned to Sung-hyun then, and something passed between them that Simone couldn't fully read. The particular language of two people who had survived the same things together for a very long time. "Take care of her," Byung-soo said quietly, in Korean. Sung-hyun answered in Korean, low and certain, and the old man nodded once and didn't ask anything further. On the drive back, Simone looked at Sung-hyun across the back seat. "What did you tell him?" At the end, in Korean. "That I intend to keep you," he said, "for as long as you'll let me." She didn't have a response for that and didn't try to find one. She just reached for his hand and let the city pass by outside the window, and felt, somewhere in the quiet of it, that maybe the weight she'd been carrying wasn't a choice between two things she wanted. Maybe it was something else entirely. The attack, when it came from inside. Sangchul appeared at the hospital just after Simone's shift ended, with a car waiting outside and a message. He's asked that you come to his office now, if you're able. Nothing more. She found Sung Hyun standing at the window, jacket off, a tablet in his hand and an expression on his face she had never seen before. Not anger. Something colder and more deliberate than anger. What happened? He set the tablet down on the desk, turned it so she could see the screen. It was a financial document, dense with numbers she couldn't fully parse, but she could read the name at the top. Cho Yongtae. My uncle has been skimming from the family foundation for years, Sung Hyun said. Small amounts, easy to miss, easy to explain away. 3 weeks ago, the same week he found out about you, he restructured the whole scheme through a shell company and pointed it directly at the account that funds your program. Simone went very still. He targeted my program specifically. He targeted it because it's the one thing in my life he could attack without attacking me directly. If he'd finished before I caught it, your funding would have disappeared by the end of the quarter, and it would have looked like the foundation's decision, not his. She looked at the document, at the numbers, at exactly how close someone had come to taking apart something she had built from nothing. He did this because of me. Because of us. He did this because he thought it would force your hand. That you'd take the Houston offer, leave, and I'd return my attention to the things he considers more important. Sung Hyun's voice was level. It was always level. But she had learned by now to read what lived underneath the level parts. And what lived there tonight was something she recognized from her own worst days in the operating room. The cold, concentrated fury of someone who had almost lost something that could not be replaced. He miscalculated. What are you going to do? What I should have done the first time he walked into my office and tried to use my grandfather's name against me. He picked up his phone, made a call in Korean, brief and quiet, and set it down. He won't touch the foundation again. He won't touch your program. I've removed him from every board he sat on and every account he had access to before tonight. Sung Hyun. She waited until he looked at her. Is he going to come back at this from another direction?
No.
He said it the way he said everything he was certain of, flat and final. He has nothing left to come back with. She believed him. That was the thing about Cho Sung Hyun that had taken her the longest to understand and would probably take her the longest to get used to. When he said something was handled, it was handled. Not managed. Not mitigated. Not postponed. Handled. She had spent her entire career in rooms full of people who talked about problems. He was the first person she'd ever met who simply removed them. She crossed the office and stopped in front of him, close enough that she had to look up, and put her hand flat against his chest the way she put her hand against a patient's chest when she needed to feel what the monitor couldn't tell her. His heart was beating hard. He was doing an excellent job of not showing it. I'm not leaving, she said. Simone, I'm not leaving because of this. I want you to know that before you say anything else. Whatever I decide about Houston, it won't be because someone tried to scare me into it. She kept her hand where it was. Are you all right? He covered her hand with his, pressing it more firmly against his own chest, and for a moment he simply stood there, letting her feel the proof of what the evening had cost him. I am now, he said quietly. If you're still here and you're not subscribed yet, now would be the time because what comes next is the part that changes everything. She stayed that night. Not in the way that required explanation, not the way Hannah would have turned into a conversation over coffee the next morning. She stayed the way people stayed when something had shaken loose and the last thing either of them wanted was the particular silence of an empty apartment. They sat on his living room floor with the city spread out below them through the floor-to-ceiling glass, and he told her things he had never told anyone else. About the years when the company had nearly collapsed under decisions his father had made, and he'd been 26 and had no blueprint for any of it. About the specific loneliness of being the person everyone depended on and the thing no one considered. About his grandfather's heart attack 3 years ago, the night Sung Hyun had sat in a hospital corridor by himself for 6 hours because there was no one in his life he could call. There is now, Simone said. He looked at her. I know, he said. That's what I'm most afraid of losing. She took his hand and held it until the city outside began to go quiet, and sometime after that, with her head against his shoulder and the weight of the evening finally settling into something bearable between them, she made a decision she hadn't planned on making that night, quiet and certain, the way her best decisions always came. She just didn't tell him yet. The next morning, she called her mother. "Talk to me," her mother said, the same way Simone said it in a code blue, which had always made Simone wonder which one of them had gotten it from the other. She didn't recount the whole story. Her mother had heard most of it in pieces over the past months. She just said what mattered right now. "I think I've decided," Simone said. "About Houston." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Do you love him?" Simone looked out at the river through the apartment window, at a city that had stopped feeling foreign to her without her quite noticing when. "Yes," she said. "I think I have been for a while." "Then what exactly are you still deciding?" She didn't have an answer for that, which was, she understood the moment the question landed, its own kind of answer. "The Houston offer will come again," her mother said gently. "Programs like that always come back around to the right person. But whatever you're describing to me, baby, that man on that rooftop with those flowers, that doesn't come back around. That only comes once." Simone held the phone long after the call ended, watching the river go silver in the early morning light, and felt the particular relief of a decision that had already been made, simply waiting for her to catch up to it. The call came at 5 in the morning. "It's his heart," Sangchul said, his voice steadier than it had any right to be. "He's had a home monitor for 2 years, ever since the doctors started watching that arrhythmia risk. Picked up something irregular overnight. Paramedics are already taking him in. Mr. Cho asked me to call you directly." Simone was dressed within minutes, and by the time she came downstairs, the car was already waiting. She sat with her knees bouncing the entire ride, running through what she actually knew about his heart, most of it secondhand, things Sunghyun had mentioned in passing over the months, a routine scan here, a word like stubborn used more than once to describe an organ that had been quietly failing for years. She found Sunghyun in the hallway outside his grandfather's room, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked like a man who had run out of solutions to buy his way toward. "They're saying it might be his aortic valve," he said, before she'd even reached him. "Calcified. Failing. Someone mentioned flying him to a specialist in Switzerland, but the flight alone." "I'll talk to his attending physician," Simone said, and went to find the cardiologist on call, pulling up the imaging through the hospital's own system, the two of them reviewing it together at a workstation down the hall. "It's severe aortic stenosis," she told Sunghyun afterward. "Significant calcification, but the geometry's workable. I can do a minimally invasive valve replacement, the same procedure my program specializes in. We don't need Switzerland. We don't need to move him at all." "You're saying you can do this?" "I'm saying I'm the best person in this hospital to do it." She said it the way she said everything that mattered, flat and certain, with no room left for false modesty. "But I need you to understand the risk before I take him into or he's 78 with a heart that's already compensating for years of damage. There's a real chance this doesn't go the way we want it to." Sunghyun looked at her for a long moment, something raw moving behind his eyes. "I trust you with his life," he said. "I trust you with mine. I don't know how to say that more plainly than that." "Then let me go scrub in." The board, when it convened an emergency session an hour later, did not entirely agree with him. "She's brilliant," Dr. Jang said, the same man who tried to talk over her in a boardroom months earlier, though his tone had changed considerably since then. "Nobody disputes that. But this is the chairman's grandfather. Perhaps a more senior." "Dr. Bishop is doing this surgery," Sunghyun said, and the room went quiet the way it always did for him, except this time there was nothing controlled in his voice at all. "She is the finest cardiothoracic surgeon in this country. If anyone doubts her competence, you may say so directly to her, in the while she's the one holding my grandfather's heart in her hands." Nobody said anything further. Simone scrubbed in soon after, her hands steady the way they were always steady once the work actually began. For most of the surgery, it went exactly as the imaging had suggested it would. Near the end, it did not. "Pressure's dropping," her resident said. "He's bradycardic. I see it." Simone's voice didn't change, didn't rise, even as her hands moved faster, recalibrating in real time. We're not losing him. Give me the pacing wire. She worked through it with a focus so complete that the rest of the world simply ceased to exist for the duration of it. And when the new valve finally seated and the monitor settled into a steady, unhurried rhythm, she felt the particular exhaustion that came after every save, the one she never let herself feel until the patient was stable. He's stable, she said. Close him up. 3 hours after she'd scrubbed in, Simone walked out of the OR, still in her surgical cap, and found Sunghyun exactly where she'd known he would be, in the hallway, having not moved the entire time except to stand whenever someone walked past with information he didn't yet have. He's going to be fine, she said before he could ask. The valve held. His rhythms stable. Something in Sunghyun's face broke open, all at once. He crossed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms, lifting her slightly off the floor, and Simone laughed, surprised, exhausted, her arms going around his neck without hesitation. You did that, he said into her hair. It's my job. It's not just your job. He set her down but didn't let go, his forehead resting against hers. You just saved the only family I have left, and I have never in my life loved anyone the way I love you right now. I love you too, Simone said, and it came out so easily that she almost laughed at how long she'd spent circling it. His grandfather woke clear-headed the next morning, and the first thing he did, once the grogginess had properly lifted, was ask for Simone. You did this? Byung-soo said, his voice thin but unmistakably himself, reaching for her hand. I told you to take care of him. I did not expect you to also save my life in the process. Occupational hazard, Simone said. I take my assignments seriously. He laughed, a thin, real sound, and looked past her to where Sunghyun stood in the doorway. Marry her, he said, not quite joking, before some hospital in America convinces her she's too good for all of us. 3 weeks later, once his grandfather was home and steady and the family had finally exhaled, Sunghyun took her up to the hospital rooftop, the same one. The night turned cold enough that he'd brought a coat for her shoulders before she'd even felt the chill. I know you already decided to stay, he said. I'm not asking you to reconsider that. I just didn't want you giving up the rest of it quietly, the part of yourself that wanted Houston, just because you chose me. He took her hands. I called Magnolia Heart Institute. They've agreed to bring you on as a visiting research collaborator. A few weeks a year, your name on their published work, full access to their trial data. You stay here, you run your program here, but you don't have to let go of that part of your ambition completely. Simone looked at him for a long moment, something in her chest loosening that she hadn't fully realized was still held tight. That's not a small thing to arrange. It mattered to you. That made it matter to me. She kissed him, slow and certain, and when she pulled back he was still holding both her hands, something different in his expression now, something she hadn't seen on him before. There's one more thing, he said, and got down on one knee right there on the rooftop. No magnolias this time, just the two of them and the cold and the city spread out below. I don't have a long speech. I've never been good with long speeches. I just know I want to spend the rest of my life finding ways to make you stay, even though I finally learned you were never going to leave. Marry me, Simone. Yes, she said, and meant it completely. And the city lights below them blurred into something warm and gold and entirely beside the point. She told Hannah the next morning, over coffee, sliding her hand across the table so Hannah could see the ring properly. He proposed, Hannah said, eyes wide. Last night. Hannah grabbed her hand, turning it toward the light, and then pulled Simone into a fierce, quick hug. I'm happy for you, Simone. Genuinely. You came here not knowing a single person, and you built an entire life. I did, didn't I? You did. If you've made it this far with them, thank you for staying. Subscribe for more stories like this one. 6 months later, Dr. Simone Bishopshaw stood in the doorway of the structural heart wing she'd built from nothing in Seoul, watching her research fellows prep for the day, a wedding ring catching the light every time she moved her hands. In 2 weeks, she would fly to Houston for her first collaborative visit with the Magnolia team, her name already listed alongside theirs on the program's incoming research. Her husband would be on that flight too, the way he tried to be on most of them now. She thought, sometimes, about a cup of coffee she'd spilled on a stranger's jacket, about how the smallest accident of her life had turned into the largest, most certain thing in it. She didn't regret a single ruined suit. She had built exactly the life she wanted on her own terms, with one man who had never once asked her to choose, only to stay. And she had,